Hello, Nick Smith here, speaking to you from London. Welcome to number 19 in our series of Alpine ClubCasts. Today, we're taking to our skis for an evening of ski mountaineering far afield with Cathy O'Dowd, Andy Perkins and Phil Wickens. I really hope you enjoy it. Before we start, I'd like to pay a quick tribute, if I may, to Nigel Buckley, founder member of the ClubCast team, who's moving on from his position in the Alpine Club Library to Balliol College, Oxford. We really wish Nigel well. He'll be sorely missed, but we still look forward to seeing him on meets, and Nigel will still be helping to coordinate the Alpine Club's UK meets programme. So, on to tonight. If you're watching live on YouTube or Zoom, please add any questions to the chat as we go along for tonight's speakers, and we'll try to get those answered at the end. And as usual, anyone in Zoom, you will be unmuted at the end for any applause, and do stick around for a chat. South African climber, speaker and author Cathy O'Dowd is perhaps best known as the first woman in the world to climb Mount Everest from both sides. Tonight, Cathy's going to take us ski mountaineering in the Canadian Yukon, and she's joining us direct from her home in Andorra. Over to you, Cathy.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. Great to be with you all. So let's go on a journey into the Kluane National Park in the far north of Canada. So we are flying north from Vancouver up to Whitehorse, then transfer by vehicle to a tiny little airstrip, and that's where we fly in to the Kluane ice cap, one of the biggest ice caps outside the Arctic regions. And I'm going to be sharing with you some images from two expeditions we've done up there, Mount Steele and the highest mountain in Canada, Mount Logan. So what do you take? It depends. The British people on the team take very skinny skis and lots of warm clothing. The Canadians take very fat skis and really don't appear to need any extra clothing. Preparation-wise, we generally divide food up into day packs. It makes it easier to distribute it across the mountainside and know how much food we've left where. And this is where we take off from, this tiny little airstrip by the edge of the Kluane Lake. The first thing we have to do is weigh everything, ourselves included, in our ski gear, ready to fly, with an absolute weight limit for the plane, and then we get to wait quite a long time because our ice cap is hidden behind that mountain range and the weather in there can be very bad. This is one of the reasons why Mount Logan in particular is not particularly famous. You can't see it as a tourist. It's not like Mont Blanc or Denali. It's hidden away. But once you get up into the air, well, this is the reason we're taking a plane. If you want to walk into the ice cap, you're welcome. But with glacial retreat, it's a very long, muddy walk to even get to the beginning of the glaciers now. Much more fun to do it like this. And the views are spectacular once you get in. The first trip I want to tell you about is actually the second one I did, and that's Mount Steele in the distance, just over 5,000 meters. And they'll be landing us there on the glacier, coming down, skis on the plane. And we are the only people out here. Not another tent, not another team in sight. The first thing you do, bury food at the landing site in case you have to wait with bad weather for the plane to come and pick you up. And now it's time to move. And from the air, those glaciers look lovely. On the ground, they just look enormous. And you realize how far apart these mountains are. We are moving, obviously on skis, pulling on this expedition haul bags, which is fine until you're on a slope and the haul bag is swinging off to the side, which is not entirely fun. Skiing with a haul bag behind you isn't also entirely fun. It's kind of like having a very fat, angry marmot running down, nipping at your heels while you're trying to do turns. So a bit of skill involved there. Initially, we're double loading, which means moving up the glacier, putting wands in to mark the route, then putting a cache of equipment, which we'll mark with a GPS waypoint. We're also GPS tracking. And then the next day we'll bring up the camp stuff. To set up a camp, obviously staying on skis, our probes, our avalanche probes out to test for crevasses before we actually dig in. And then lots of happy times digging walls for tents. We did like digging walls. I'm not sure we knew what we were doing though, because at least once we dug for winds coming from the west, they promptly swung round to the east and our walls turned into a massive snow trap, which we then had to dig out in the course of a storm, but you live and learn. Nice big tents, quite luxurious to take tents this big and this heavy. Tent living, condensation freezing inside the tent every night, which then melts as soon as the sun hits the tent. So a good deal of mopping up to be done. Cooking in our rather generous porches. On the one expedition, we took gas. On the other expedition, we took liquid fuel. Both of them work. You know, there really isn't much difference. The big advantage of these big tents is you can get all 6 people into a single tent, which is really useful to have a discussion or do your route planning. Big country, big views. This isn't like being in a mountain range where it's a narrow spine. This is this huge block of peaks and glaciers. And we did get some spectacular views. This is another commonly climbed mountain, Mount Luciana. People traverse that ridge. But our expedition didn't work out too well. We had 2 objectives, really. This one was Mount Walsh, which was meant to be an acclimatization objective. And then the main objective was the southeast face of Mount Steele. And we had the same problem on both of them. It had been a dry winter, which is probably climate change. So where we'd hoped to see big slopes of snow that we could climb up fairly easily and then ski back down, what we got were endless open crevasses and lots of patches of blue ice. And we hadn't really come equipped for that level of climbing, and it meant we weren't going to get to do the fun thing, which was to ski back down those slopes. So the Mount Steele expedition didn't work out so well. But in the distance, that mass, that's a single mountain. That's Logan. It's the highest mountain in Canada, 2nd highest in North America. And I think it's the biggest in terms of just being fat and wide, like a huge slice of cake. It's the biggest in the world. So for Mount Logan, which I went in 2 years earlier, we fly around the mountain. The plane can't get over the top. And this is our route in. This is the standard route on Mount Logan, the King's Trench. And there's some wonderful big crevasses there that we're going to have to navigate our way through. That's when I like being on skis, in crevasse territory. Mount Logan up there on the left. So same deal, set up a base camp, leave food at the base camp for when you come back, and then start to move up the mountain. On this expedition, we were actually using sleds rather than haul bags, and I prefer sleds. You've got more control. The fun bit about double loading, carrying a load up, leaving it going back down, is getting to ski back down. And here we simply strap empty sleds onto the back of our rucksacks to get back down. Not the only team on Logan. Now, you're probably aware that at this point there are 1,000 climbers on Denali in the season. It's a bucket list mountain, despite the difficulty. Logan, there are probably about 100 climbers per season at this point, but it's getting rapidly more popular with commercial teams. The crux of the King's Trench route is this icefall section, which has got some fairly steep slopes. So, of course, we can't use the sleds. Everything's on our back at this point. And some fairly large crevasses that you want to dodge your way around. Again, we didn't have the weather we expected. You go to Logan with all this reading about terrible storms, and it was hot as hell. Again, potentially climate change. We're up here at 4,500 meters, stripped down to our thermal underwear, slogging up these cambered slopes, pulling big weights. And this was no fun at all. But skiing back down the stuff, that's a lot of fun. To be able to put in these big turns with these views out. At this point, we're looking right out to the Pacific Ocean in the distance, just beyond Mount St. Elias. The skiing down is great. So the most difficult moment of the expedition came as we moved up to what I think was our fourth camp. Bad weather. Not too bad, just pinned down for a couple of days, having to dig the tents out, but otherwise okay. But our problem is what happens next. So we're sitting up there at about 5,000 meters at the Red Arrow. And this is the trouble with Logan. There's a pass at 5,500 meters, and then there's the plateau. And we've got to go from one end to the other. That's 12 kilometers of distance. And unlike elsewhere on mountains, where on skis you can lose height fast because you just turn the skis downhill and start going. To get off the Logan Plateau, you've got to climb back up to the col and then go over. And this is where people die because they can't do a rescue in bad weather on the plateau. So we had two members of our team who were not keen to move onto the plateau with a dubious weather forecast. And three people who were really keen and one who wasn't sure and lots of debate. Eventually, four of us went. Two decided to go down. Four of us crammed into a three-man tent, pretty cozy. One turns, everybody turns. And we got a beautiful summit day, but we knew there was a front coming in. So we're trying to cover those 12 kilometers and climb the final distance, racing a weather front. Big views, amazing. But if you look at that snow, this isn't powder anymore, hard-edged sastrugi. And it's all very well when you can see them. High up, eventually we dump the skis and keep on moving for the top. We're racing the weather front and we are losing. We get to the summit with the mist having come in and get no views at all. So slightly disappointing summit experience. And then we get to go all the way back to our high camp on a compass bearing because we can see nothing. So we're roped up. We're, doing the beginner snow plow. We cannot see those hard-edged sastrugi. We're just bumping into them. And we're taking our bearings off the GPS and then using a compass to actually follow the bearings. Yeah, long, hard descent. But then the next day, the sun comes out again, inevitably, and a beautiful long ski down. Heavy rucksacks, having to manage the sleds, but an amazing place. A couple of days of waiting for the plane to come in. We had left so much food at base camp. We just ate and ate and ate everything. It was great. And then the plane comes in and another expedition is over. So that's my story from Logan. And at this point, I'd like to hand the baton on to Andy Perkins. Now, Andy is a British mountain guide with 30 years of experience as a climber and a skier, lots of great expeditions. He's also one of the important people involved in putting together the Kendall Mountain Festival. So, Andy, it's all yours.
Good evening. Thanks, Cathy. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to take you to, well, we're going to stay in the same hemisphere and we're going to move across the Davis Strait to Greenland. Cathy's story started with an aeroplane. Mine starts with a boat. This boat, the Destiny, run by two very good friends of mine, Andy and Janice, and I've been a Destiny groupie for a number of years now, starting off skiing in Norway, around the Lingen and Finnmark areas, and then subsequently to that, off to Iceland. And that was the first time really, we're talking about now about ski mountaineering far afield in remote areas. And I must say I really related to Cathy's comment there about, there's nobody else in this area. When you're in the northwestern corner of Iceland, Hornstrandir Peninsula, there is nobody else in this area at all. You're very much on your own. Now, Andy and Janice had this plan to take the boat from Destiny from Finnmark across to Hornstrandir and then around to the west coast of Greenland. And eventually they were going to go through the Northwest Passage and across to the west coast of America. Didn't quite work out as they planned, however, because our first intention was to ski off the boat from around Manitsoq, but because of immigration difficulties in Greenland, they had to leave, and there was no dry dock in Manitsoq to put Destiny in, so they transferred north to Sisimiut, just about 150k north of Manitsoq. And the idea was that we would then rejoin them and then go from there back down to Manitsoq again. But about 6 weeks before the trip, it became evident that they couldn't even put Destiny in the water because there was 6 feet of ice in the harbour in Sisimiut. And so we had to come up with a plan B. And I often find that with expeditions that the plan Bs will actually work out better than your plan As. And the plan B was from a local operator called Sirius, run by a chap called Bo Lings, and involved a 30-metre snowmobile trip across one fjord and then across another to end up at what was euphemistically called a tourist hut. And so we arrived in Greenland in late April 2018. Quite difficult to get a lot of stuff organised, and this is where you need an operator who can handle everything. And I can assure you that Bo can handle absolutely everything. I mean, he is massive. It's not photoshopped. I'm a normal size, by the way. I'm not a dwarf. He is absolutely chuffing massive. And he sorted out, for a start off, the snowmobile ride in. And these are our 4 wee chums here, people who I've skied with a great deal, all dressed up in their Guantanamo suits to go for a 2.5-hour snowmobile ride. I always find it's a very exciting time on an expedition when you go into the Massif for the first time and you actually see what you're having to deal with as opposed to just pictures. You can see that the team are riding along in the ski bus behind the snowmobile, and all the freight, food, fuel, etc., is being dragged behind snowmobiles as well. Often on steeper slopes, the snowmobiles have to go in tandem to pick them up. And after 2.5 hours, we arrive at our home for the week, which is this little hut here. Basically a deluxe bothy. I think I can put it that way. We've got a living space on the left and a dormitory on the right, and a dry toilet in the middle. Living space, of course, is the most important. Andy and Janice from the boat, from Destiny, are there to cook for us, which is great. There's heater for making hot water and keeping the place warm, of course. But the most important thing is we have a very, very decent supply of alcohol. You can see that it's ski in, ski out. This is taken from Google Earth. You can see the hut here and some GPS tracks from an Italian colleague of mine who'd been in the area. And when I was looking around at first, I thought, well, what's the skiing going to be like? And I thought, well, and this line here jumped out at me as the very first thing, particularly as he'd been up to the base of it, but hadn't actually skied it. Unskied at the time. And so that was the first thing we tackled, particularly given the fact that it was quite bad weather that first week. Having some visual frame of reference to operate from was very, very important. And so it was really satisfying for me, both as a skier and a guide, to be able to guide first descents in such a remote place. And the troops are super happy about that. You know, already the trip's been worthwhile because we've had such an amazing descent. Another the kind of things we do with the boat is that we leave the boat, traverse over a peninsula, and the boat comes around and picks us up. And this trip that we did with this first week also worked out like that, where we could ski down and then have Andy come around with a snowmobile and pick us up on the other side. So we're doing through trips, but then always returning back to the same base in the evening. People, of course, want to know, well, what's the snow like? And the answer is generally, of course, when you ski with me, the snow is always fantastic, always brilliant. But no, joking apart, there's not a lot of snow on the west coast of Greenland and a lot of wind transport going on. You can see the depth of the snow. You can see the grass poking through there, and then drifts of light wind drifts, particularly in the fjord areas. that was the end of the first week. And then I had another team coming straight in. At the end of the first week was pretty poor weather, but then it picked up straight away. And you can see that having a marvelous time going across frozen sea fjords there. And this was really an opportunity for me to really see what potential the area held from a ski mountaineering point of view. The hut is basically located here, and you can see that in the background, there's just acres of ideal ski mountaineering terrain, and particularly this area. And I must say that these two peaks in particular, the one here and then the one in the background here, both caught my eye as potentially having a lot of potential for good skiing. This is the peak going up the peak on the right. You can see not super steep, but the scenery is really quite grandiose, and the climbing, of course, because I know a lot of the people here will be interested, not great. And of course, you've got massive cornices at the top to deal with. This shot taken from the top of the peak on the left just shows you the amount of potential. Here we've got the Davis Strait lurking out in the distance over there, but you can see there's a massive terrain here for ski mountaineering. The snow on northern aspects of that first trip, but because you are in quite a remote area, even dibbling towards 30 degrees, quite important to observe very strict avalanche protocols. So you can see the team here, we're skiing it one at a time, and the guys are all well spaced out as we come down slopes anything more than 30 degrees. It's not all beer and Skittles and waist deep powder. Sometimes we had little problems, and this is typical of an expedition again, particularly in Arctic areas where the seawater is coming up through the ice, and we've got the ski bus jammed, and the only way is to disconnect the snowmobile from the ski bus, and then for us to tow it back to the hut bar on foot, and then spend the rest of the day drying our feet out. The last day on that first trip, we managed to ski a couloir just behind the hut, but only to within about 150 meters from the top, because the wind is so strong. You can see the wind howling at the top there. It stripped this all off down to bullet hard snow. And so we had to content ourselves with just staying in the lower sections. But I'd already seen the potential of the area, and I thought I've just got to come back next year. So managed to persuade two groups from the Eagle Ski Club to come back in 2019, by which time Bo had bought a ski bus, which was great. And I had a little bit more knowledge, which meant that I could approach the hut directly from above instead of being skidooed all the way in. And I wouldn't have dared to have done this sort of thing unless I had known exactly what the terrain is. And even then, just trying to find a cornice on the edge of a pass here, always good to lower people in first and have them test the snow rather than yourself. As I said, the weather for this first trip was mostly very, very, very good in 2019. And again, we saw this massive potential of stuff to be done all around the area. And again, nobody else there. However, it was heating up, and you can see here that the snow is now starting to go a little bit more springy. We've got a lot of sunballs lying on the slopes there where people are skiing. And towards the end of the trip, it got quite challenging to manage the avalanche risk with the snowpack heating up so much. Sometimes the avalanches were quite significant. As it heated up, of course, it means that the temperatures, instead of being around the sort of -20 area, came to sometimes above zero. So the skiers kind of get into their spring coats, and so do the animals. A lot of people, when they think about Greenland, think about, well, polar bear action. On the West Coast, there are none. They've shot them all. So we don't have to worry about that. Don't have to carry a rifle or anything like that. The other wildlife that you get to see around a ptarmigan, and of course, reindeer. And very special moment for me was to see this at very, very long range. This is a digitally enhanced photograph of muskox around about 1 kilometre out, which was very, very exciting. And that led us on to the last week of 2019, where it was getting super warm. And we tried to snowmobile in the normal way, which would be like this, left Sisimiut and got about that far. and everything got bogged down. So Bowling's at Sirius says, right, well, in that case, what we're going to do is we'll take you around by boat to the edge of the pack ice there at the end of the blue line, and then you can snowmobile in from there, and the guys will bring the other snowmobiles around on the yellow line and meet you at the sea ice interface. And it kind of worked out. We got on the boat and then went round to the start of the ice, and I was thinking, well, how are we going to know when the ice is strong enough to hold our weight? And the answer is you drive a boat at it really, really hard and fast until the boat won't sink through the ice anymore. And then the captain just turns off the engine and jumps out and walks around on it, with the theory being that if it will hold 5 tons of boat, it'll almost certainly hold us and all our kit. Meanwhile, the snowmobiles, which were supposed to meet us, were delayed for some reason. In fact, they got bogged down, even just driving them themselves. So the only thing to do when you're in the Arctic is to just wait. And I was tickled slightly when Cathy talked a bit about waiting, because expeditions are like that. You do spend a lot of time waiting. And after about 5 hours, they eventually showed up with very wet pants. They'd had quite an epic getting there. It was an amazing job actually to get them in, which meant that we couldn't use the bus, of course. We had to tow all the skiers behind snowmobiles, which is, it's just like a normal ski bus, really. Quite low tide skiing by this point. This is the first week in May. We're down to spring kit again. You can see from the texture of the snow, as Cathy talked about rock hard sastrugi in the previous talk, and you can see that this is nice spring snow. It's gone all granular on the surface, and that means that it's perfect conditions for skiing steep couloirs. And this was the couloir that we failed to ski the previous year, coming in from the top and skiing it was a fantastic 800-meter couloir down to the sea fjord. And there was one thing I had left to do, which was this mountain in the background, which we'd christened the Walrus, because it had these 2 fantastic sort of tusk couloirs, which we call the left and the right tusk. Again, you can see firm snow, frozen, taking crampons really, really well, up to the summit of the ridge. And then to get into the right-hand tusk, roping folk in, and then just finding the right aspect of slope to ski fantastic spring snow all the way back down to the sea fjord again. And I must say, it's one of the highlights of my career, both as a ski mountaineer and as a mountain guide, to be able to take people on such a fantastic journey. Journey's not over, of course, until you're back in a place where they can serve draft beer. And the way to do that is that they brought in 2 boats, one of which was a landing craft, because we've got to get the snowmobiles back by this stage, drive the snowmobiles directly onto the landing craft, and then sail off into the wide blue yonder. That's the end of my little slot there. I'm now going to hand you over to our final speaker. Our final speaker has been climbing mountains and ski mountaineering since he was 18. He's led 20 yacht-based skiing and climbing expeditions to Antarctica. He's summited 120 different Antarctic peaks, 43 of which were first ascents. He also has the dubious honor of being a former Alpine Club vice president. Will you please put your virtual hands together for Phil Wickens?
Well, thank you very much, Andy. It's a very interesting talk there about Greenland, a place I absolutely love as well. But for this evening, Nick asked me to talk about how to get to Antarctica and what to do once you're there. Well, there are 4 ways that you can get to Antarctica. The first, you could go and work for the British Antarctic Survey. And that's the way that I first got there. I worked as a field guide with scientists at Rothera Station. Now, strictly speaking, you aren't meant to do that much recreational skiing and climbing. But of course, there is a chance that in the pursuit of science, you might find yourself on the summit of a very remote mountain with your skis. So this here is the top of Novosin Peak. It's at 76 degrees south, where my colleague Dan and I collected some very interesting fossils during what was a truly amazing season in which we summited a dozen or so peaks on skis, and then had the delights of skiing down the mountains with rucksacks filled with heavy rocks. But the fossils were amazing. But not all bass field work is in the mountains, and you're just as likely to find yourself working in the middle of a big flat white expanse where the highest point literally is just the top of your tent. Now, if you don't mind spending 3 years away from home, working for the British Antarctic Survey is a fantastic way of truly experiencing Antarctica. And if you do so, and you spend the winter there, that is the best time. Every wintering person has the opportunity to get away from base when you're not working. Now, this here was a weekend of ski mountaineering on a group of peaks called Stokes Peaks. They're about 10 miles from Rothera. But it's really the week-long trips away from base that makes wintering in Antarctica so special. Every member gets 2 week-long trips in the middle of winter, and you can go skiing and climbing, and nothing too risky, but this is a peak that was very special to me. It's called Mount Reeves, and I was fortunate enough to climb it on skis during my second winter. And as you can imagine, it is a truly magical place to know that you're probably the only people climbing not just on a mountain, but on a whole continent on that day. We'd left the skis 100 meters or so below the top because it was very, very icy. Now, if you don't want to commit to 3 years away from home, well, how else can you get to Antarctica? Well, you could always go there on a big cruise ship. And although you are likely to have a very good time, you probably aren't going to get an awful lot of climbing or skiing done. Now, that said, if you do go on a smaller ship, there are smaller ships that do offer some ski mountaineering, although the trips that they offer tend to be shorter half-day tours on the smaller peaks that are close to the sea. And so to climb and ski the higher and the more remote peaks, such as Mount Francais here, you really do need to travel under your own steam and to get there by yacht. And as Andy said, I've now done 20 expeditions to Antarctica by yacht. And by going this way, you now have the flexibility to go ashore as long as you want, to do pretty much whatever you want and go wherever you want to. Now, although it's not cheap, it is still a lot more affordable than the fourth way of getting to Antarctica. And that, of course, is to go there by air. But flying there really is your only option of getting to the mountains that are deep inside the continent, unless, of course, you want to haul sledges for a long way from the coast. So this here is a Boeing 757 landing on the Union Glacier at ALE's camp in the Ellsworth Mountains. And it's from here in the Ellsworths that smaller aircraft are able to reach pretty much anywhere within the continent. It does cost a fair amount of money, but you can get to some very, very remote places. So this brings me to objectives. In my experience, the skiing deep in the heart of Antarctica tends to be rather wind hardened and wind sculpted, since it receives very little precipitation. So what I'm going to do is focus on the area that I think offers the very best ski mountaineering, and that is the Antarctic Peninsula. The mountains of the Antarctic Peninsula, they're alpine in size, up to 2,800 meters or so, but they're very much Himalayan in nature, with literally glaciers perched on top of glaciers. And being a maritime climate, this area receives a lot of snowfall, and the skiing here is just truly breathtaking. This is a lovely little hill called Edge Hill, perched above the Wickens Glacier. Well, the Antarctic Peninsula itself, it stretches for just over 1,000 kilometers. And the spine of the peninsula is actually a narrow plateau at around 2,000 meters that's capped with an ice sheet. And both sides of that peninsula, they drop down steeply down to the Weddell Sea on the east side and the Bellingshausen Sea on the west side. And because the Weddell Sea is covered or choked with sea ice, it's really only the west coast that you can access by yacht. And the plateau, for that whole distance, almost the whole distance, it's flanked by an almost continuous line of dramatic faces and ridges. And then on the top, there are lots of pretty rounded summits all the way along its length. So a very big contrast. I took this photograph as we traversed the narrowest section of the Antarctic Peninsula, and you can see in the far distance the mountains that stand above the Weddell Sea on the east side. Now, although this does look pretty benign, there are actually very few places indeed where you can safely escape down to the coast. So it is an extremely serious place to be. Well, on either side of the Antarctic Peninsula are literally thousands of individual mountains. Now, most of the more accessible ones have been ascended, but there are still a number of peaks here that nobody has ever been to the top of. From a skiing and climbing perspective, I divide the Antarctic Peninsula into 4 regions. There's the northern region, which is the most easily accessible. It takes about 5 days to get there by yacht from South America. And the advantage here is much of the coastline is free of ice by early summer, even much of it within the winters now. So this is the area that most of the private ascents have been done in. And then we have what I call the Crystal Sound region. And this is probably where most of the unclimbed mountains lie. And although it only takes an extra 2 or 3 days to get there by yacht, the area is often choked with ice, it's unpredictable, and that ice can persist through the whole summer. And added to that, the coastline isn't very well charted, there are lots of rocks, but it's certainly a place for an adventure. Going a bit further south, we have the Marguerite Bay region, and unlike Crystal Sound, this area tends to be free of ice after midsummer, so it's very accessible to yachts if you have the time to get there. But this is also the area where, particularly us British, have had Antarctic bases located now for the last 70 years. And so virtually all the peaks in this region have been climbed. And then we have the far southern part of the Antarctic Peninsula, which is much more difficult to access. Now, there are some very interesting objectives at the northern end of Alexander Island, which is a big island on the left, which you could approach by yacht in a low ice year. The remainder of the objectives on the main peninsula, you would really need an aircraft to get to. Now, I think it's worth highlighting the seriousness of operating in such remote locations. Even in the very northern Antarctic Peninsula, where there are plenty of ships that could easily assist with a medevac from the sea, once you're away from the coast, you are very, very much on your own. In some ways, it's even more serious than skiing to the South Pole because there are simply no aircraft that come in and get you if you mess up. So it's essential to have a good plan of how you're going to get somebody to the coast if there is an accident or extended bad weather, and how you're going to get out if you do get packed in with ice along the shore and the yacht can't come and get you. So I think it's important to be a lot more cautious here than you would be, say, in the Alps. It's not the place to be pushing your ability or to be jumping off of cliffs on your skis. And because the area is often very heavily crevassed and the majority of the coastline is flanked by tottering ice cliffs, it's better to do out and return trips rather than traverses where on a traverse you might end up having to descend something that almost completely blindly and getting into trouble. By doing an out and return trip, you can probe and mark any crevasses during the ascent, and then you get to know the ground that you're going to be descending down later on. So what have been my favorite ski descents and ascents in Antarctica? Well, to be honest, it's very hard to choose favorites because pretty much every time I put skis on, I'm about to embark on what I think is the greatest ascent and descent I've ever done. But some highlights would certainly include the mountain at the very back of this picture. This is called Mount Cornu, which is a stunningly beautiful peak. And it has got a very elegant ski line up it with the Eagle Ski Club group. A few years ago, we made the first ascent. And what made this peak so special, as well as being a very beautiful peak, was the incredible views from the summit looking south, and an absolutely first-class descent in some really tremendous snow. Well, another of my favorites has got to be Mount Matin. And this is a peak that originally inspired me to return to Antarctica by yacht. And this was climbed with the Alpine Club expedition, and to be the very first people to stand on the summit of a mountain that was actually over 1,000 meters higher than was previously thought, that was very special indeed. And equally wonderful was a descent of almost 2,000 meters back to our camp far, far below on the Hotine Glacier. And the final peak that I have got to mention is Mount Francais. It's 2,825 meters high. It's the highest peak in Antarctica north of the Antarctic Circle. And climbing it is just a great adventure. Just to get to its base involves 3 days of skiing through very dramatic scenery. And then the mountain itself just seems to keep going on and on and on. It is endless, but the views just gradually getting more and more spectacular until you emerge onto the summit. And each time I have been up here, the snow has been absolutely amazing for the descent. And with a descent of over 2,100 vertical meters, it does make that long approach very worthwhile indeed. So I hope that gives you a brief overview of how to get to Antarctica and some of the objectives that you can do as a ski mountaineer. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass you back over to Nick.
Thank you, Phil. That was a really entertaining talk, stunning photos, and wow, that Mount Cornu looks absolutely amazing in particular, I thought. Thanks also to Cathy and Andy, of course. I must buy some skis. Okay, folks, so if you have a question... Okay, yes, there's a question already from Alex Metcalf, a regular. Go ahead, Alex.
Hi, guys. I had a question for Phil. Great talk, mate. Great photos as well. What sort of experience would you need to be a field guide for the British Antarctic Survey?
Yep, good question. To be a field guide, they're looking for people that have a lot of experience in expeditions, in operating in remote glacial places, often places without fantastic maps. So not so much staying in mountain huts, but tented camps for months on end, and with a solid sort of mountaineering background. Anything such as Mountain Leader Awards or above that would certainly put you in good stead.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I've got, whilst we're waiting for more questions, I've got a question. I know, Phil, you touched on this. I was just curious, perhaps the other two could talk a bit also about the, in none of the areas that we're talking about, is there any sort of potential rescue on hand? I'm just wondering how this affects your sort of decision-making beforehand, and then also, I guess, your psychology once you're actually underway in such remote spots. Cathy and Andy, do you want to come in on that?
Well, certainly I think I'm the least remote of the three locations, so there is rescue possible. It's just going to take several days to get to you, and they're going to have to wait for the weather to improve. So first of all, how are you going to call it in? So on the one expedition, we had a satellite phone. On the other one, we simply used the InReach text devices. So either of those will work. Then you've got to think about how are you going to stabilize your victim and sort of keep them comfortable and alive and hopefully not deteriorating over the space of several days. And then whether you're going to be able to get them down to where people can land or whether they're going to have to come up and get to you. So it's certainly going onto a trip like this, there's a limit to what we can do as a team. We try to have a doctor on the trip, but it's not always easy to find them. They don't have the leave, or you end up with someone who's a specialist pediatrician, which doesn't actually help you with kind of field emergency medicine. So most people on the team will have done kind of remote location emergency medical training. We try and be careful beforehand. So we agree, for example, that if the team splits, which it may, and it did on the one expedition, you don't split alone, given this is crevasse territory. You split in pairs, which is difficult if one of you wants to go one direction and 5 of you want to go in the other direction. So it's not a perfect solution. We're just careful.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting how you finished up there, Cathy, with talking about, say, careful. And so the margins that you want to have a larger margin of safety than you might in a European Alpine context. And so that's to say that you, from say an avalanche perspective, that you need to be very, very sure of the snowpack before you would commit to certain committing descents. Where in the Alps, you might just jump in and think, oh, I'm pretty sure it'll be all right. You want to have more of a sense of confidence in the snowpack. And equally, I would say it's as a general rule in both Arctic and Antarctic latitudes, and perhaps both Phil and Cathy could comment on this, I find the slopes to be bigger and more of a consistent angle. So if you've got a bullet hard snowpack like you have in Greenland, if you fall over even on 30 degrees, you are not going to stop. And so you have to have a greater degree of confidence in your in the people that you're skiing with, that they will not fall over in that kind of terrain. So it's having larger margins than you would otherwise have, and having the really good communications. I know Cathy kind of opened up with a whole comms aspect, and so some form of comms has got to be duplication there, as well as, because if one form, like I said, the radio goes down, then you've got some other form of sat phone, for example, and then they're in reaches. And so it is becoming easier, but nevertheless, it is a very committing environment. And so I'll fall back to what I said previously, which is you've got to have a very large margin. And of course, everybody's super motivated in these. You spend a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of prep to get to the place, but if the conditions aren't right, then just enjoy your time there in what is an amazing part of the world.
Yeah, there's an interesting point there about it's not necessarily that you want incredibly strong skiers. You want sensible skiers, the kind of ones who will choose not to fall over rather than go for a hell for leather descent.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think one other thing is the size of the group. I think it's very risky to have a group that's so small that you cannot split into 2 groups. So being able to have a group that is 5 or 6 people, where you can provide literally search and rescue cover for each other and to safely medivac down to the coast. And the other thing, in Antarctica, we do have a very good network with the other operators, the yachts and the ships, that will provide assistance once you're down to the coast. But in the hills, it's up to yourselves and your team. You make sure your team is able to deal with a situation, and you have to rein things in a bit and not go berserk.
Thanks, certainly, I must say in Greenland, and to a certain extent Iceland is the only time I've carried ski stretchers. You wouldn't normally carry those in the Alps, I think it's fair to say, but it's part of what the self-reliance that Phil referred to there, which is to have your own capacity to evacuate somebody down to the coast, which is where you're going to get assistance, particularly in these maritime areas.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got a few questions coming in now, which is great. So I'll do. There's one come in from Nick Wharton. He's written a question. He says, "How much are you hoping to get done this coming winter?" Which is rather a topical one. Cathy, do you want to go ahead on that?
Well, this is where you really get to realize you need to live in the right place. I'm kind of locked down, but we're not in Andorra. We can't leave Andorra, but I have ski touring on my doorstep. So I expect I'm going to be ski mountaineering in the Pyrenees in Andorra this winter.
Wonderful. Phil and Andy?
Oh, I just checked the text of what Nick said on the chat, and he said, "How much are you hoping to get done?" Well, everything that I would normally do. That's what I would hope for. What am I expecting to get done? Well, that's completely different. My kind of the general, general feeling in the water in the Chamonix area is that things will open up for Christmas, and then there'll be a resurgence of cases, which will mean that they'll be back to lockdown in January, maybe into early February. Then it'll open up again in March, and then everybody get ill again. And then towards the end of the season, it'll be back into lockdown again with the third or fourth wave. So it's just going to carry on doing that for a while. So, well, what's the safest thing to do, or the most likely thing to do? And that's probably going to be day touring from a valley base. That'll be my kind of personal view. So you can stay in your bubble in the valley. You're not mixing with people in huts, and you're not going into the large cable cars like, say, the Aiguille du Midi. You're going to stay on chairlifts and smaller bubbles. So that's what I'm kind of expecting to happen. But I'm ready for anything. And as Cathy said, being based here, obviously you can take immediate advantage. The blockers are going to be difficulty in international air travel, or in fact a closing of borders, followed by our facilities and ski resorts such as Uplift, and even accommodation going to be open. And those are the challenges, and it's really anybody's guess. If I had a crystal ball and was a mind reader, I wouldn't be working as a mountain guide, I'd be working on the stock market.
Yeah, myself, I think similar. If it's unlikely I can get to Antarctica this season, who knows, maybe the Alps, but one thing is for certain, I would be able to ski tour across the Peak District on grass. I think that's going to be it.
Thanks very much. There are a couple of things coming on YouTube, I think. Nigel, do you want to tell us what that is?
Yeah, we've got two questions. One from Tom Davis-Merry, and it's a question for Andy and Phil, and that's only because Cathy's already touched on it. How have the effects of climate change affected how you conduct expeditions and the objectives you can pursue?
Shall I start, Phil?
Okay, go on.
Yeah. It was very noticeable to me that, well, you saw the development through those two trips from one year to the next. Those two trips to Greenland were done exactly the same weeks, and the second year, 2019 as opposed to 2018, was considerably warmer. Is that climate change, or is it just a blip? It's just an observation that the second year was significantly warmer, and so it's a matter of, for me, how to cope with climate change. It's a question of being adaptable in terms of expectations for everybody, and not necessarily focusing on 100% on the quality of the snow. It's more about the experience. And for me personally, of those 4 weeks that I did, the last one was the best, because it was so unpredictable and so unusual, and like, what on earth is going to happen next? It was really exciting. And so I think it's just how to deal with it. It's just a matter of staying adaptable and open and flexible, and rolling with the whole thing.
I think in Antarctica, what I'm seeing is that the smaller coastal glaciers, they seem to be accelerating. A lot of landing sites that I used just 2 years ago, you could not get up those slopes anymore. It's not simply that the snow is opening up, the snow bridges are disappearing. It's that crevasses are forming and everything is becoming more broken close to the sea. Up high, it is not a big change, but close to the sea. So you can't expect to go to the same sites that you've done before. And then in addition, yeah, the snow, some seasons it disappears early, but season before last, it was good skiing right up until March. So it seems to be very variable, but the acceleration of the glaciers does seem to be quite, it becomes more marked every year.
Thanks, Phil. Actually, Nick Wharton's just added something to the chat. He says, look out at the Kendall Mountain Festival for a film called Falling Mountains. There's a question. Could I go next to Paul Newby? Hello, Paul. Are you there?
Yes. Hello, Nick. Thank you very much. A comment for Phil and a question for Cathy, if I may. Phil, you astonished me with the amenities at your hut in Greenland, right down to the Gigal Côte du Rhône on the table. By extraordinary coincidence, I came straight to this meeting from a wine society meeting with Philippe Gigal, telling us all about his vineyards at Ampuy. There he is. And extraordinary coincidence and a very good choice on your part, but you astonish me.
Thank you.
Greenland. Now, you mentioned wild animals, Cathy didn't. And Susan, sitting here beside me for Cathy, said, what about polar bears? Do you have them in that neck of the woods in Canada? Or
no.
Else
no, there are no bears there. Basically, there's nothing there except bizarrely small birds. I mean, like really small, charming ones. All the ridges on Logan are called after, of course, I can't think of the names right now, but they're called after various tiny little birds. And we had one of them that turned up in our base camp and hopped around and had a snack. And I think it's because we're so close to the Pacific Ocean and they're getting blown inland. So you end up with these charming little things hopping around your camp. But that's it as far as animals, certainly on the Kluane ice cap go.
So that's safe and also sweet with the little birds. Jolly good.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Next is Richard Toon. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah. Hi. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, and it's already been slightly answered. It's where are we able to go ski touring in the next 3 or 4 months to avoid COVID, to get reasonable weather, good snow conditions, and also where the insurance is affordable?
Nick, do you want me to take that opening?
Please, yes.
Okay, so one of the things we haven't admitted that is that myself, Andy, and Phil, we're all members of the Eagle Ski Club, who does some really good expeditions around the world. And I run the Eagle Ski Club's webinar program. And I'm afraid the answer to the question is going to have to be Scotland. I can't promise good weather, but but between quarantine and lack of flights and the possibility of ski resorts closing down, and Alex is right in his comments. So I'm about to drop into the chat box. Tomorrow night, the Eagle Ski Club is running a webinar specifically about ski touring in Scotland. And we've brought in Alan Sloan, who has skied over 100 Munros. So he really knows the terrain. And he's going to be sharing with us where to go, when to go, how to try and get the best possible value out of ski touring in Scotland. So it's a Zoom webinar. We hold Zoom open. You don't have to be a club member. I've dropped the link into the chat. And for the guys on YouTube, if you just look for the Eagle Ski Club Facebook page, you'll find an event post. And there's a Zoom link, so everybody's welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'm in the Eagles as well, so I can look at that stuff. But, the final point, I don't know whether other people have got any knowledge or views about this. Insurance is becoming a real issue. It certainly is for me as I get older. But, what's happening to the European health card, for example, in January?
Well, you better ask Boris, haven't you? I mean, you're the guys who are leaving.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Andy, do you want to come in on that? Do you, as you know?
I would say that in terms of the practicalities of skiing, I kind of addressed that earlier, which is to say that I think that ski mountaineers and ski tourers are going to be in a better position to get their fix than off-piste or certainly piste skiers. So I think we're in a very fortunate position in that sense as skiers coming at the mountains from a mountaineering background, which is certainly I would say the ethos of the Eagle Ski Club, more or less, compared to people who are coming at skiing from a downhill skiing perspective. So from the point of view of facility or getting our fix, you know, we're enjoying the uphill as much as the downhill, and so we're able to stay out of the uplift. Then is not a problem. Secondly, I think, Richard, you referred to, you know, the problems of, I all referred to the problems of international travel, and that, again, it's a matter of being adaptable, a bit like in the face of climate change. It's a very unpredictable thing. People aren't going to be able to plan ahead as much. And so, unfortunately, for those of us who've got jobs where leave needs to be booked well in advance, that is going to be a problem. From an insurance perspective, it's a tricky one, and I'm a French passport holder, so that doesn't affect me. But I appreciate that lots of people in the UK are going to have more of a challenge than they did in the past. But Americans come skiing in Europe and they don't have a European health insurance card. I'm sure these problems are not insurmountable. And as things become clearer post 31st of December, there'll be a market for people needing insurance to go skiing at whatever level it happens to be. And I often put people in the direction of a company called Impact Multisport, and I'm very happy to post that on the chat if people would like. It's a company that's linked with the Guides Association here in France, and so it's not a fly-by-night. They're very good with the evacuation side. Now, healthcare, that's a different matter entirely. It's not my area of expertise, but I very happily post that link on the chat if people would think that would be useful.
Great, thanks, Andy. It sounds like living somewhere like Andorra is just the absolute perfect place to be, or in Scotland at the moment. So that's something to dream of. There are no more questions as far as I can see. So unless anyone wants to raise a hand. Oh, there's one coming from Nigel, just as I was about to sum up, from YouTube. Nigel, go ahead.
Before I do, I'll just go back to Cathy's little birds and ridges on Mount Logan. One of those is Hummingbird Ridge that had its first ascent in 1965 and has never seen an ascent since, by Alan Steck. I think it took a month or so.
But the Hummingbird isn't the only one. It turned out there were a couple of others. And they've all got names of tiny little birds. You really wouldn't think we're doing sort of high altitude mountaineering.
Yeah. All right, I'll go to my YouTube question now. So Cathy, Phil, or Andy, wondering if you have experience in glacial travel whilst pulling pulks, and how you found navigating crevasses and managing the rope systems with these big pulks. Thanks. That's from Charlotte Workman.
Well, I think the other two have more experience, but I'm just going to say very quickly on Logan, Americans pull vast pulks. I mean, that you could put a McMansion on the back of the kind of pulks Americans brought to Logan. We brought little ones. We, took kids' sleds and turned them into pulks, and they were much more maneuverable, much, much easier to handle. So, and, we still managed to cart around 4 weeks worth of supplies in those big, comfy tents. So I think not pulling a big pulk, pulling a smaller pulk might be a place to start.
Yeah, I'd back that out, Cathy. I mean, my experience of dragging pulks is on Denali, and we use a similar kind of sleds with solid traces, like you guys were doing on your second trip. And the only thing I would add to that is that I found it very helpful when we're skiing down to wrap knotted prusik cord around the base of the sled so it doesn't catch you up. So it's actually acting like a brake. So you take just thin prusik cord and you use this as a brake so the pulk doesn't run you over if you stop. And I found that relatively straight. I wasn't. You're not getting as much fun out of the skiing as you would do normally, but it's manageable. In terms of navigating around, and when if you've got a big weight, particularly going up, then it's very important to have the pulk attached to the rope behind you, because if you go in and your mates aren't super alert, if the pulk follows you in and hits you on the head, you're going to be in serious trouble. So the pulk needs to be attached with a prusik cord to the rope behind you so that it doesn't follow you in. And that's very important. And that's worth practicing perhaps in a European context before you get out there. There's bits and bats of other stuff, but those are the main things. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree there. Yeah, make sure the pulk's are attached to the rope behind you with a prusik loop. The smaller the better. I tend to use for anything up to 10 days an Ortlieb dry bag that you drag behind you, a heavy duty one. You can get 10 days worth of food plus a plus tent and camping kit in there, and have your day stuff on your back. And dragging that with a single rigid pole, you can actually ski pretty well with that. It's quite surprising because you don't have to worry about the sled turning over because it hasn't got an upside and a downside. As for longer trips, converted children's sledges, I found them very good. And exactly as Andy says, I have normally 3 different rope brakes, each with a carabiner on each side that I throw underneath the sled to control the back. So if it's very icy or very steep, I have all 3 rope brakes with little knots in them, and it works really well. It stops the sled from overtaking you.
Thanks everyone for joining us. I'll keep an eye on the raise a hand thing just in case anyone does have another question. I'll just tell you about what's next. The Alpine Clubcast number 20 is in 4 weeks' time on the 15th of December, and this is entitled The Shining Mountain, a Changabang Special. Nigel Buckley will be talking to Chris Bonington about the first ascent of Changabang in 1974. And then John Porter's going to take us up the South Face, which he did in 1978. And then finally, Andy Cave is going to tackle developments on the North Face. I'm really looking forward to that, I must say. Do have a look at the Alpine Club Library YouTube page where you can watch, like and share all the previous Alpine Clubcasts. So folks, yeah, thanks all for joining us. Keep safe, keep active, and thanks so much to our speakers tonight.